on last Tuesday, we did the kind of basics of conformity. We talked about the Sharif, the Alport, and the Ash studies. And then we continued on talking about norms on Thursday. We talked about breaching. We talked about groupthink. And today we're going to talk about pluralistic ignorance and unpopular norms. And if we have time, we might talk about bystander intervention. But we'll probably cover most of that on Thursday. Okay, so pluralistic ignorance, which is a very strange expression, which is very hard to pronounce. What is this idea? Well, pluralistic ignorance, it's important to understand the backdrop that pluralistic ignorance as a concept is responding to. So the conventional picture of norms and conformity that social scientists hold is that norms happen when the majority of people hold some view. Then what happens is conformity pressures lead this view to dominate the group. And this is roughly the situation with the Ash experiment, right? Where like you've got 8 Confederates, they all hold some view, and then if you come 9th, you're going to assume that view as a result of conformity pressure, right? But what researchers on pluralistic ignorance and researchers on unpopular norms challenge is this assumption that all norms are popularly endorsed, that all norms are in fact privately popular, that the majority of people really supports the norms in a group. And this is a perspective that's widespread in the social sciences. It's not just in social psychology, this idea that norms must be popularly endorsed, that they must be supported by the majority. It's something that's reflected in most of the major theoretical perspectives in sociology and the social sciences. So, for instance, the conflict perspective in sociology, a perspective associated with Marx and people like Gramsci. This perspective says that norms are useful and they're sort of created by the dominant classes to create false consciousness for the masses. And while this doesn't necessarily say that all norms are popularly endorsed, it does say that they're useful, that they're pragmatic, that they serve some purpose. Then functionalist accounts in sociology tend to assume that norms are popularly endorsed and serve some kind of function. Also, utilitarian perspectives in economics and the rational choice perspective in sociology assumes, again, that norms are useful for society or for dominant groups in society and are popularly endorsed. And this is, in all ways, the sort of dominant perspective. You, sir, in the hat, can you stop text messaging in my class? Thank you. So, pluralistic ignorance is a concept that comes up in opposition to that and challenges this idea that norms are popular. So, pluralistic ignorance is a term that was coined by Floyd Alport in 1924, the brother of the guy with the dirt fetish. And pluralistic ignorance is defined as when a norm is privately unpopular but publicly accepted by most people. So, in other words, it's when a group mistakenly thinks that a view is held by a majority of people when it is in fact held by just a plurality, a group of people that does not constitute a full majority. So, pluralistic ignorance in this way involves conformity gone awry. We would expect conformity to normally be the case when a majority of people has some view and people succumb to the pressure to accept that view. That would be the normal perspective on conformity. This is what we're trying to do in the Ash experiment and to a lesser extent in the Sharif experiment. In pluralistic ignorance, though, a norm is somehow misperceived and then conformed to. People do not correctly observe the actual private endorsement of the norm. They believe a norm is privately, popularly supported when it actually isn't, and then they conform to what might be a non-existent conformity pressure. So in other words, I always have trouble saying this. I do research on pluralistic ignorance too, and it's so embarrassing that I can't say the damn expression. In other words, pluralistic ignorance involves unpopular norms, which to many sociologists for many decades would have been considered a contradiction in terms. So here's some more descriptions of pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistic ignorance is when no one believes, but everyone thinks that everyone believes. This is a definition by Kretsch and Crutchfield from 1948. And groupthink, this concept that we talked about in some detail on Thursday, could be thought of as involving pluralistic ignorance, since often in groupthink, the group makes a decision that the majority of members are privately uncomfortable with. And here I would ask you to think about that cartoon, right? The cartoon where the boss says, does everybody support this plan? You know, say aye. And everybody goes aye. And it seems to be popularly endorsed. But then privately, everyone has their doubts, right? And if you think about that political cartoon, or that cartoon, in a lot of ways, it's the exact opposite of the Ash experiment, right? In the Ash experiment, there's 8 people that presumably believe this norm, right, and say this line's equal to this other line, even though it's seemingly not true. And then the 9th person comes along. They privately are not so sure, but they conform to it. In pluralistic ignorance, the majority is all doing what the 9th person does. The majority of people are saying I when they really think to themselves no. And so the big question is, how could that happen? How could it happen that we would conform to a norm that isn't actually privately endorsed? How would this ever come to be? It seems like the situation would be like the Ash experiment, like where 8 people have some view and then the 9th person falls in line. And so basically 89% of people have the view, but it looks like 100. How could we ever have a situation where 30% of people have some view, but it looks like the majority? And that's what I'll try and talk to you about today. Okay, so what are some examples of this? There's quite a few examples from the history of social psychology. Schenck, in 1932, did a community study of people in some town in the Midwest, I believe, showing that community members would criticize drinking and gambling in public, but then in private, they would drink and gamble a lot because it was fun to them. Breed and Costanz in 1961 did a survey showing that people in New Orleans tended to overestimate opposition to integration, which is kind of confusing. They overestimated support for school segregation, racial school segregation. So people thought that everyone else was a big segregationist, but when they actually did private surveys, it turned out that support for segregation was much lower than people thought. Cordy in 1972 did a study showing that students at Vassar College tended to perceive one another as very left-wing and very politically radical, but then in private surveys it was revealed they were substantially less radical. So people's perception of the average radicalism on college campuses in this time may have been exaggerated, may have been greater than it actually was. And indeed, in 1972, George McGovern ran against Richard Nixon for the presidency and was going to supposedly win on the youth vote, or had his best chance to win on the youth vote. And that youth vote didn't turn out to be the landslide support for McGovern that was expected by most analysts. And then the classic, maybe my favorite example, and this is why I assigned a paper to this effect. In a paper that was conducted, or that was published in 1993, based on a study that was conducted in, I believe, 92, students at Princeton overestimated other people's comfort with excessive drinking on campus. I don't know if you all are familiar with this. I wasn't until recently. I went to Princeton to give a talk, and they have these drinking clubs, which are sort of like fraternities and sororities. And these drinking clubs, they just like get together and they just drink their asses off. Like it's this big Princeton ritual, goes back hundreds of years. It's really unclear why it's like legal and stuff, because there's, I think, lots of underage drinking. I don't know. I don't know the insides of these things. It sounds terrifying. I'm not, I don't know. These Ivy League rituals, they scare me. But in any event, this is this big thing on the Princeton campus. This is big culture of like this drinking club drinking. And what they found was that when they did this study of like, what do you privately think about drinking? How comfortable are you with this like excessive binge drinking all the time? What they found was that the majority of Princeton students, even the ones in these drinking clubs, which is like 90% of the students, they tended to say, I'm actually not so comfortable with the extreme levels of drinking. Like, I don't actually want to spend my weekends just constantly vomiting and taking ibuprofen and whatnot. But then when they were asked, like, what do you think everybody else thinks? They were like, oh, yeah, no, they love it. Everybody else is really into this, But that can't be true, right? It can't be the case that everyone's saying they're uncomfortable with it, but then everyone's saying that everybody else would say they're comfortable with it. Do you know what I'm saying? There must be a misperception at work. People are misperceiving the real norm. And so some of the details of the study, they even overestimated a close friend's comfort with the drinking norms on campus. So when asked, talk about, your best friend, they'd say, oh, yeah, he or she, they're very comfortable with all the drinking. I'm not. So it wasn't even just that they weren't very good at assessing general population attitudes, which is very difficult, right? We pay people to assess general population attitudes because it's not easy. It's even their closest friends, they had this misperception that they were comfortable with it when they themselves were not. And then this norm had teeth. It had real behavioral impact, right? I mean, you might be saying, okay, so they misperceive the norm. Who cares? It doesn't do anything. It doesn't affect behavior. In fact, Prentice and Miller in 1993 find that it actually affected their behavior over the course of the semester. Remember the Ash study. Remember the Sharif study. When we perceive a norm in groups, we tend to assimilate to that norm. We tend to fall in line and conform to that norm. So you perceive a norm, you'll tend to conform to it. The commitment consistency, Or, well, think about the social pressure in the Cialdini book. Think about the Prentice and Miller reading, which you've already read. What they found was that people tended to assimilate to the drinking norm over the course of a semester. So that by the end of the semester, the discrepancy between their private beliefs and their perception of everyone else's had gone down because they'd started to adopt those underlying beliefs and presumably drink a lot more. And this makes sense. People's attitudes tend to fall in line with their public behavior. So what probably happened was they misperceive the norm as everyone's comfortable with it. They're not comfortable with it. They fall in line with the norm behaviorally and start drinking excessively in order to avoid social sanctions and be accepted. And then their attitude starts to fall in line with their behavior, right? Cognitive dissonance theory. But again, this is also counterintuitive. And in general, researchers haven't found this effect where pluralistic ignorance tends to go away as people obey the behavior and then their thoughts fall in line with their behavior. So this is the only time this has been found. And it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Because you would think that this means that pluralistic ignorance sort of sows the seeds of its own demise because it leads you to conform in your behavior and then your attitude falls in line with your behavior, and before you know it, the norm isn't unpopular anymore. So this is sort of a puzzle of unpopular norms and pluralistic ignorance. Any questions? Yes, sir.
I thought it was just men.
That's true, yeah. No, technically that's true. In the study, very good, very good. So in the study, it is only the men that they find a behavioral or like an actual attitudinal conformity over the course of the semester, not the women. And they don't really explain that great, right? I don't know. I mean, not that I have an obvious explanation for it either. I mean, one thing could be that the experience, men may have the experience of like, oh, you know, I'm conforming to this norm, boy, this is fun. And then women on college campuses, especially in the early 90s, excessive drinking, they maybe perceive themselves to be a personal danger or risk being in these sorts of settings, and that may stop them from having their attitudes assimilate to the norm. Other questions? Okay. All right, so what would cause this? That's how I set up this lecture. This is a puzzle of unpopular norms, of pluralistic ignorance. God, yeah. Never choose to do research on a topic you cannot pronounce. It will cause you, it will embarrass you. It's been embarrassing me since the fall of 2000. It's 10 years of embarrassment. Continued right through to this minute. So what are the mechanisms, the causes that can help us explain pluralistic ignorance? Yeah, I'm going to call it like PI from now on. Okay, so one idea is of why we might get these strange results where a majority is holding some view and voicing that view while a minority, or it's only a minority that actually privately endorses it, is bad sampling. That it may be that as we go to assess the norm in our environment, in a group we're in, we sample poorly and don't accurately infer what the view really is. And I think this is pretty plausible. So there's a lot of ways that bad sampling might work. Okay, so one is information cascades. It could be that as some new topic or stimulus or event or song or movie or something like that appears on the scene, a few early people voice their attitude and then have a disproportionate impact on everybody's attitude after that. And then as a result, even though most people maybe wouldn't privately like it, they'll say publicly they like it just because there was this cascade of attitudes that were voiced in support of it. So let's say, for example, that you're in a group of 8 people and you just saw some movie, and in actuality, 5 of you hated it and 3 of you liked it. But if those 3 people that liked it express their opinion first when you're hanging out later, then it's very possible that you'll get the impression that everybody liked it, and you'll say, oh, yeah, yeah, it was okay. Man, that movie sucked, And as a result, it'll seem like a majority of people supported the movie. And a good example of this can be found in the Sulganic et al. Reading that you were assigned. And another good example is the thought experiment that I told you about, the New York City restaurants, right? Where I told you, this is something economists like to talk about, is say these 2 restaurants open up in New York City on the same day, no one's in either of them. The first person goes up to them and is like, I don't know which one to go to, I'll flip a coin and go to restaurant A and neglect restaurant B. Then the second person comes up and it's like, I have no idea, no one's ever eaten in either of these restaurants, I'll just go to the one with one dude in it. And then the next person comes and is like, oh, that one's kind of popular. And then before you know it, this restaurant's got overflowing with people, is very successful, and this one's totally neglected. And it's just because of early movers having an effect, having a conformity pressure on subsequent patrons. Another way in which bad sampling could work is not this ordering effect where a cascade happens because of early people voicing their opinion or making their choice and having disproportionate social influence on others. Another mechanism is visibility of behavior. It could be that more visible behavior is more easily viewed. Well, that's obviously the case. And then it gets perceived as normative. So think about a couple of these examples that we were talking about. Think about the drinking one. Say you're on Princeton campus. It's the early 90s, and some people are comfortable with the excessive drinking. Most people aren't. But let's say you're walking around campus, and you're like a first-week freshman, okay? And you're walking around, and you're trying to figure out what's the normative level of drinking. What are you going to see? You're going to see the excessive drinkers, right? They're like falling all over themselves. They're having whatever, lots of fun. They're doing whatever drunk people do in public. And then you're not going to see the teetotalers, right? Sitting in their dorm rooms, playing Star Wars video games and drinking, literally drinking tea. I don't know which one of those I was in college, but I haven't really painted a very pretty image of either of them. But which one are you going to see? And so as you see that more visible behavior and you infer what the norm is, you might get it wrong because you're oversampling one behavior versus the other. And this might help explain the protesting on college campuses one, right? Where in the early 70s, at least on one college campus at Vassar, students were overestimating how radical everybody is. Well, again, put yourself in the shoes of an undergraduate at Vassar in 1972. And you're walking around campus and you're trying to figure out how radical is everybody? How much do they oppose the war in Vietnam? How much do they oppose Nixon's election in 1972? And you walk around, and what are you going to see? You're going to see public protests, right? You're not going to see the people who are quietly have their political opinions and are going off voting. You're going to see the people who go out in the streets with big signs and are purposefully trying to shape the apparent norms and create social pressure in favor of their political positions. And so it's not surprising that people would overestimate the radicalism on college campuses in the late 60s and early 70s. And that could also help explain the New Orleans overestimation of support for segregation. Segregationists would go out in public and loudly, try and stop buses from integrating schools. So that's going to be a very visible behavior, right? So it's understandable how a more visible behavior would be misperceived as more popular than it really is. So public behavior could be a bad source of information due to bad sampling. Another thing is an oppressive regime. Say you have a dictatorship, a totalitarian dictatorship in a country, they could essentially outlaw one behavior and promote the other, leading everybody in that country to mistakenly believe that the one norm that's legal and is governmentally encouraged is actually privately very popular, and that the one that's illegal is unpopular or maybe even unheard of in the country. So a big example of that, or one of the classic examples of pluralistic ignorance, is the rapid fall of communism. So around 1989, all of a sudden communism fell in many, many countries. Hey, can you all there be quiet? Thank you. You've been talking a lot. Thank you. All right. So around 1989, a cascade of revolutions happened all across Eastern Europe. And don't talk about me telling you to stop talking. Okay. A cascade of revolutions happened. Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union, a couple years later, stopped being the Soviet Union, became a series of confusing things. The Confederated States of the... Do you all remember what that one was? The Confederate... CIS or something? I can't remember either. Okay. So in any event, communism fell really rapidly. And all of these political scientists around the world were like, whoa, how did that happen? How was it that communism fell overnight like that? It doesn't seem possible. It doesn't seem possible, A, for change to happen that rapidly, when we've never had revolutionary change in that many countries go off like that before, well, except maybe since 1848. But also, it was curious because we thought communism was popularly supported. You'd see public demonstrations in support of communism in all these countries. You didn't see loud dissent. You certainly didn't see many public protests leading up to it. A little bit in East Berlin. But in general, this was an exceptional story. We didn't see a lot of public protests before it all came down. Okay, all right, there was a Solidarity Party in Poland, and there was some protests in East Berlin. But for the most part, not the kind of like earth-changing, we're about to topple the government sort of public protests you'd expect. So this was a big surprise to people. But what it turned out was that people were scared, right? People in communist dictatorships were scared to say that they actually oppose the government. And so what happened was, actually something like 70, 80%, I'm guessing here, we'll never know, but maybe 70, 80% of people were discontented with these dictatorships that they labored under, and all they needed was for a few people to go out and make it okay to protest, and as soon as they did, it triggered a cascade where people's private opinions came bubbling to the surface, and the Berlin Wall fell, and the Soviet Union broke up, and so on. Okay, and this led to this larger principle that when dictatorships collapse in the face of revolution, it may be incredibly unpredictable. Because what it is like 10, 15 people go out in the central square in East Berlin and publicly protest. It's on TV, and then all of a sudden it snaps, and the regime can end. Also, and this is something I talked about a little bit already when we were talking about Sharif, it could be that your sample, as you go to assess the popularity or functionality of a norm, it could be that your sample of public opinion is outdated in a sense. It could be that norms persist past their usefulness. That a norm starts perhaps because it is useful and is popularly supported, but then over time, that popular support wanes and it's simply propelled by conformity pressures. And so norms may live on past their carriers and may have lives unto themselves. So for example, the Sharif generational study, which I talked about when we talked about the Sharif conformity study last Tuesday. In the Sharif generational study, they have a bunch of people identify how much the light is moving on the wall, right? And they all estimate it, but then they start subbing individuals out and subbing in new individuals until they've completely replaced the population. And what they find is that that group estimate of how much the line has moved, or sorry, how much the red dot has moved, persists even with all these new people. And so that's an anachronistic norm. And so what are some correlates of that in real life? Well, the persistence of customs that once served some purpose, but now are just customary, which is a concept known as cultural lag or culture lag, which was invented in sociology by William Ogburn, I think. And what are some examples? Summers off from school. We get summers off from school, right? Thank God. Why do we get summers off from school? What's that? Farming, exactly. It used to be that the United States workforce was overwhelmingly agricultural, overwhelmingly farmers. And so you had to have the kids go home and work the farm in the summer. Now, I think the farm sector of our labor market is less than 1%. I think it's been less than 1% for probably at least 50 years, or well, at least 25 years. And now it doesn't make any sense, right, to have this, right? I mean, we don't need to take summers off. Do you need to take summers? I don't need to take summers. Yeah, no, we don't need to. All right, let's get rid of it. Well, it serves some new purpose, and you can imagine it would be damn hard to get rid of it, right? Because it's backed by real social sanctions, real social enforcement. But the original reason has waned. Yes, sir. Yeah, all right. No, I'm okay. I'm okay with that. Yes, I'm sorry for criticizing anachronistic norms. I should adopt a more positive perspective. Yeah, I don't know, man. Yeah, I dig it. I dig what you're saying. But yeah, no, obviously we all like the summers off thing. That's an example. There may be other examples though where we that are less positive. I don't know. You'll have to make your own qualitative judgments of of what you think of these norms. I definitely am not trying to suggest one. Okay. Other examples, beauty marks and, beauty marks. Do you know where we got these from? The answer's right there. Okay, so beauty marks supposedly were a result of a smallpox epidemic in Europe. And moneyed women, aristocratic women, would put beauty marks over the top of their massive, disgusting, pussy smallpox sores. I know. That was pretty gross. I went a little further than I needed to with that. And so they put beauty marks over the top of them so that you wouldn't see that they have massive, no, just kidding, disgusting smallpox sores. And now they became associated with, women of high class, women with very nice dresses, and then you just see beauty marks go with that. And now I think we all have beauty marks. We all have beauty marks because we're trying to look like aristocratic French women from the 17th century with smallpox. And I think I mentioned this as well, pockets, collars, and tails on suits are all sort of anachronistic fashion staples, the things that we still put on suits, but they're not They're not, they don't serve the function they originally served. So why did we have tails? Because men would wear jackets while they went horseback riding, and they wanted to not tear the backs of their jackets. Why do we have, well, now we still have pockets, but the pockets, they don't even open, right? They're ridiculous. Like, they're just these lines where they're seemingly pocket, but there's no pocket there. Collars, the collars used to serve some purpose. You'd flip it up, but now often you can't flip it up. Most of the time, I'd say, most suits you'd buy, you can't flip the collar up. It's sewn down. And so these are just anachronistic. They refer to some old functionality that is now gone, but they have some perhaps new value that's positive. Yes. So more on unpopular norms. Here is yet another term for pluralistic ignorance and unpopular norms. It is the emperor's dilemma. And I think you read part of the essay on the emperor's dilemma, right? Good. Thank you. You read. I appreciate that, sir. Okay. The Emperor's Dilemma refers to the Hans Christian Andersen story, The Emperor's New Clothes. How many of you are already familiar with this story? Okay, cool. All right. Beautiful. Okay, so I'll nonetheless tell you the story. So, so in The Emperor's New Clothes, 3 con men come to some town, and they promise the emperor to make that they will make the finest clothes out of a cloth that's so fine, so awesome, that it can't be seen by stupid people. And the only people who can see it are smart, and the people who can't see it are unfit for office, whatever that means. I don't know. But basically, they're stupid. So in fact, of course, there are no clothes. These con men are con men, and they're not really putting any clothes on the emperor. So finally, the emperor shows off his new clothes at this fancy parade where he comes out and he's like, "Look at my fancy new clothes. You can't see them, you fool." And what happens, everybody's like, "Oh my God, the emperor's new clothes are fantastic. I love the fabric, the cut. Oh, geez, it's so good. It's so well tailored." But a single child laughs, right? The single child does not understand the rules, doesn't understand that if you don't see the clothes, you're a moron. And so the child points and laughs at the naked emperor because the emperor is naked and looks very silly. And this triggers everyone to laugh in turn. This single child breaks the spell that kept the emperor's dilemma, this unpopular norm, this pluralistic ignorance in place. Because remember, no one really sees them, but they're conforming because they think you're supposed to, and you'll be judged if you don't. This is a picture of the naked emperor. It's a rather like PG-13 one, right? Just his thighs are showing. And I remember I was working on this paper with a couple of with my advisor from graduate school, and then another colleague of mine, and we had to make a presentation. And I had to go to like the children's library to like find pictures of naked emperors. And this was the best I could find. I found another one where the guy's like full on naked, but it looked really ridiculous. I didn't want to offend you. I know you guys have you have very refined sensibilities. I don't want to offend. Okay. So let's talk about the emperor's dilemma. Let's talk about the emperor wears no clothes, this story. And let's analyze it with some concepts from class. So the norm, what's the norm? Well, the norm is to see and praise the emperor's new clothes. Is it popular? No, it's an unpopular one. No one actually sees the clothes, right? No one actually sees it. Instead, it's propped up by what? Is it informational influence? Are you inferring that there really are clothes because everybody else is saying it? Do you actually literally see clothes there? No, it's not informational influence. It's normative influence. The reason you conform is you're afraid that you'll be called unfit for office, that people will judge you as stupid because you're the only one that doesn't see the clothes. And then as with some unpopular norms, the spell is rapidly broken by a single dissenting voice, as in the fall of oppressive regimes. So what example is this most like, where the kid gets up and says, "I don't see the clothes, this is hilarious, this emperor is a fool," and everybody laughs, and it goes away really quickly, because underneath, they all doubted the norm the whole time. What example is this most like? The fall of communism, exactly. Where a few people go out into the central square in Berlin and say, "This is bogus," and you all think this, and then it breaks the spell, and everybody falls in line with the revolution. But is this what typically happens, is the big question. Is this the normal story? Is the fall of communism as a result of an avant-garde that goes out and voices dissent? Is that what normally happens? Is it the case that when there's an unpopular norm to see the emperor's clothes, that a single kid can laugh and it'll break the spell? Is that normal? Is that the way unpopular norms work and the way pluralistic unpopular norms work? Well, I and a few scholars, a few of my colleagues said, no, that isn't the typical story. That may happen sometimes, and that happened with the fall of communism, but that's not the typical story. That instead, what would normally happen if the kid stood up and says, I don't see the clothes, is that someone would enforce the norm on the kid. Someone would sanction the kid and be like, you, sir, you, son, are unfit for office. So we introduced this idea called false enforcement. And what is this idea of false enforcement? It's the idea that it is the enforcement of a norm that one privately disagrees with. And we believe that false enforcement can contribute to the stability of unpopular norms. The normal picture of unpopular norms that comes from Hans Christian Andersen is a very unstable one, right? If one kid is too ignorant of social rules to conform, then it'll break the spell. Or if one person is maybe courageous enough to stand out, then it might break the norm. But is this what normally happens? So perhaps in the real world, when the child laughs at the emperor, it wouldn't start a cascade. Instead, she or he would be sanctioned, and it would actually increase the social pressure and further bolster the norm. Because if you see the kid stand up and say, the emperor's naked, and then a variety of people jump up to say, no, you need to shut up, the emperor is fully clothed and looks fantastic, then that would only reaffirm your concerns that you might get sanctioned if you spoke out, right? So then the question is, why would somebody falsely enforce? It's easy to imagine that false enforcement would bolster unpopular norms and be part of the story of their persistence and perpetuation. But why would it happen? Why would somebody falsely enforce? Well, they might do it to signal the sincerity of their earlier conformity. So having conformed, you might still be nervous that you're not signaling sufficient sincerity to the dominant norms in a group or in some culture. And you might go a step further to even enforce those norms as a way to show that's how conformist I am. That's how obedient I am to the group's norms. And that's how sincerely conformist I was earlier when I fell in line. And you can imagine the opposite. You might take a reputation hit, right? If you were to not enforce a norm that you went along with, why would you not do that? Are you a hypocrite? Are you insincere? Are you posturing for social approval? And here it reminds me of this quote from Robertson Davies, the writer Robertson Davies, who said that fanaticism is overcompensation for doubt. That when you see somebody vehemently enforcing norms, one of the things you might want to first suspect is maybe they don't even believe the view that they're enforcing. Maybe they do. Maybe they're the strongest believers. But actually, maybe they're a non-believer who's insecure that they'll be found out if they don't enforce the norms. Here's an example, the Salem witch trials. Have you guys read Arthur Miller's The Crucible? Have you read that? Raise your hand if you have. Wow, that's cool. All right. So I love The Crucible. I think it's an amazing play. And the whole thing is an allegory for what? McCarthyism, the Red Scare in the United States in the 1950s, well, 40s to 60s. And the story in the Salem witch trials is that a few girls in Salem, Massachusetts, come out and say that they've been, that there's this witch in town who's been, possessing them and making them possessed by demons, and they turn in this witch. And then pretty soon this hysteria spreads around Salem as people turn in more and more witches. And why do they do this? Well, they'll go to you and they'll be like, okay, so you're suspected of being a witch. Somebody named you as being in the devil's company, whatever exactly that means. And you're given a few choices. You can confess, you can deny it, you'll probably be killed either way, or you can turn somebody else in or turn in multiple other people. And indeed, Arthur Miller, in an essay he wrote about the crucible, said, naturally, the best proof of the sincerity of a confession was your naming others whom you had seen in the devil's company. So this was the way to get out, was to confess and name names. And this was why Arthur Miller chose the Salem witch trials as his allegory for the Red Scare. Because how did you get out of, say the FBI knocks on your door and they say, you're suspected of being a communist. We know you went to a communist meeting in Greenwich Village in 1949, and we know it was, awesome. And and you're suspected of being a communist. We're going to throw you in jail. We're going to charge you with treason. What do you do? Your way out was to say, yes, I was there, and here are the other 15 people who were there. And then you get off, and those 15 people wind up in the same situation you were in. And that's the emperor's dilemma. So, what are some examples of false enforcement as an effort to show sincere conformity to norms? So one example that's been shown in past research is gay bashing as a way to prove one's own masculinity. Maybe people who express loudly homophobic comments and are derisive of homosexuals, maybe they are in fact covering up their own insecurities, their own identity concerns. And indeed, there was an experiment that was conducted by Adams, Wright, and Lohr in 1993, which showed that men who expressed more homophobic attitudes were actually more sexually aroused by homosexual pornography, which is very interesting. And I conducted an experiment showing that if you make a man insecure about his masculinity, he's more likely to express homophobic attitudes. So again, think about Robertson Davies. Maybe fanaticism is overcompensation for doubt. Maybe when you see someone with loudly homophobic attitudes, you ought to suspect that their private opinion is the exact opposite, that maybe they actually are concerned about their own sexual identity. Also, sanctioning mild, politically incorrect comments to show one's own political correctness. I mean, we see this all the time, where people get jumped on for maybe small comments where they didn't even mean to say what they said, and then people jump in and they're like, this is my opportunity to show how egalitarian, unprejudiced, or politically correct I am. Also, sanctioning people who don't understand esoteric scholars so as to demonstrate one's own erudition. This is something I talked about earlier in the semester, that I had this experience of going into a philosophy class and not having understood Martin Heidegger and feeling like I was justified in not understanding Martin Heidegger because he was really friggin' hard to understand. And he himself said he was writing from the Black Forest as though he was acknowledging that he was an esoteric guy. And what happened, people were like, you are a Philistine. They were like, jumped on me, and they made fun of me, and they sanctioned me. They took me to the bathroom, gave me a swirly. The whole thing was terribly embarrassing. I've been scarred ever since. Other examples. You can criticize maybe others' lack of patriotism in order to demonstrate your own patriotism. This is something that you definitely see in everyday life. And yet another example, turning in communists or witches to avoid suspicion of being one oneself. Let's take a 3-minute break, and then we'll come back and talk more about pluralistic ignorance. Okay, so back to unpopular norms. So a few years ago, I and some colleagues of mine, pardon like the self-referential research stuff, but it is the study that's I think appropriate to talk about now. I and a few colleagues of mine conducted a study to test this idea of false enforcement. Because though it had been hypothesized in prior research and it had been shown that false enforcement can help perpetuate unpopular norms for obvious reasons, right? If you're not just conforming with a norm, but then enforcing it on others, then that's going to increase the social pressure on others that will lead them to conform, even though you privately don't believe. So we know that false enforcement can help prop up or maintain unpopular norms, but is it real? Does it really exist? Is it the case that people will not just conform to a norm, but enforce it on others as a way to signal the sincerity of their conformity? And so in a paper that I wrote with some colleagues, we tested this idea, and we tested it in the following way. We had a bunch of undergraduates like yourselves sign up for an experiment. And the way that they had to sign up for the experiment was they first had to go online and qualify for the experiment, or be sorted. Actually, they didn't have to qualify, but they had to be sorted into high and low aesthetic discrimination groups. So we had them take a test where they looked at a series of painting pairs. There were just 2 pairs of paintings by, significant artists of the 20th century, or so we said. And we said that one of these painting pairs was picked to be on a list of the top 100 paintings of the 20th century, which is sort of a ludicrous idea, but I'm sure somebody's done this. So, and we said, now you need to try to guess which one was the one that was picked. And this was like impossible. They'd be like almost identical Rothko paintings or almost identical paintings by obscure modern artists that you had never heard of from Argentina or something. And you had to pick which of these 2 apparently identical paintings was the one. And it was almost impossible. So people did the only thing they could do, which was guess, more or less. Guess or kind of go with their gut instinct on whichever one they liked best. And then we'd say at the end, congratulations, you aced the test, this is amazing. You've been slotted in the high art or the high aesthetic discrimination category, and now you can come in to the lab for a wine tasting test because your aesthetic tastes are so refined that, we've put you into the high group, And what we were hoping is that people would be like, oh shit, like I guessed on that test and I don't know. I thought those paintings were equal. I don't belong in this group. These are people who can really figure this kind of stuff out. I can't. So what we did was we then took them into a room, and my friend Ko, who's a good friend of mine, he ran the actual participants in the study in sessions, and this was very fun. I had him dressed like a sommelier, like kind of dressed like he was serving wine with like the napkin over his his forearm, and he'd be like, hello, welcome, and he'd sit people down in this lab environment at a computer and then bring them these samples of wine, which they were supposed to taste. And beforehand, we had these instructions that said how they were supposed to taste the wines. And the instructions said, there's this long-standing tradition called the Dutch round, and this tradition is, it was invented in the Netherlands. And what happens is people taste wines in a circle. They stand around in a circle and they taste wines. And then, after giving their opinion of the wines, they then give their opinion of each other. They then evaluate one another and evaluate each other's wine tasting abilities in turn. In fact, of course, there was no such thing as the Dutch round. We just made it up. But its rules were perfectly made for the experiment that we wanted to create. So what we said was, we're going to do an experimental version of this. And first, we're going to have like some kind of getting to know you thing where we'll exchange personal information, and then we'll do the Dutch round, this classic, rich with tradition ritual from the Netherlands. And so then we had people introduce themselves, and we randomly assigned the order. But in fact, it wasn't random. We had four people that were computer programmed that always went first. And those four people, they identified themselves as all being like seniors who had like, artsy-fartsy majors, or like very, very intelligent majors, and they all played like very like sophisticated instruments, and they all spoke foreign languages, and they all, I think, intended to go to graduate school. So like, like an intimidating, heady group, right? Probably much like yourselves, actually, which is why I'm always so intimidated in here. But it's true. I can't speak another language. I can't play another instrument, and I never actually graduated from college. So, yeah. So anyway, so these people, very intimidating, right? And then the subject had to go, and they'd say, okay, I'm 20, I'm a sophomore, and my major is sociology, and I can play, I can't really play an instrument, and I speak Spanish. I don't know about you French-speaking, violin-playing philosophy majors. And so, this aesthetic discrimination environment is getting amped up, right? You're getting terrified. This person's into art history. This person's into philosophy. I'm getting freaked out. We're about to taste wines and try to evaluate them. I never really taste wines and evaluate them. And then finally, the sixth person goes, and they're simulated, and that person has like a GPA that's like, 2.5 to 2.7. They're like a freshman. They play like the recorder, and... and they speak like Finnish or something as their second language. Nothing wrong with any of this, but it's less of this kind of intimidating cultural credentials kind of environment, right? And we sort of designed this person to be like the lone child that would laugh at the emperor. No offense to the Finnish. So what happened was they then go to rate the wines. And two of the wines were actually, I can tell I'm going to get in some kind of trouble for what I've just said. I don't know how it's going to happen, but this is webcast. And I'm sure, anyway, I'll report back on what kind of trouble I get into. It'll be amusing to all of you. So you had to taste these wine samples, and two of them were identical. But the four people who went first said, my God, wine A is amazing. I mean, it's so effervescent, it's robust, its flavor, it's dry. Sure, it's dry, But, the bouquet, And so they rated wine A very high. And then they rate wine B as like, this is rubbish. This is terrible wine. I don't know why I was served this. I'm upset. I might leave the experiment early, etc. So mind you, these wines literally are identical wines. They're poured from the same bottle, one after the other. And we were interested in, would the subject then conform to this norm, right? And of course, 50 years of conformity research shows, yeah, the subject's going to conform to the norm. They're going to say wine A is better than wine B, and they did exactly that. But that's not what we were interested in studying. What that is essentially the experiment started next. And what we had the sixth person, the one who played the recorder and had, like a so-so GPA. We had them say, these wines are totally equal and they're okay. I don't know what you all are going on about. So that person is sort of like the child who laughs at the emperor, right? And we're interested in what happens when the child laughs at the emperor and says these two wines are equal, or the emperor isn't really wearing any clothes. And so then we come back through a second time. Again, this is the Dutch round, so you must then, after tasting the wines, evaluate one another and their wine tasting abilities. And we had the subject in the study always go first. Now, in half the time, they went first, and their ratings were going to be public. Everyone was going to see their ratings, and everybody would be aware of what their ratings were. And in that condition, what'd they do? They sanctioned the deviant, right? They said that this lone child who said the wines were equal is a fool, is a moron, didn't have any wine tasting abilities, and they said the first four people, excellent wine tasting abilities, very refined, yada, yada, yada. Again, even though these people are saying two identical wines are very different. But then in private, when they were freed up to say whatever they thought, what did they say? Well, in private, they said, no, the deviant got it right. Those two wines are totally equal. I just went along with it because, whatever, there was a lot of pressure. I was nervous. I'm young. I'm scared. And I don't taste wine very often. And then they said the four conformists actually weren't that good of wine raters. So in private, the lone deviant is more competent in wine ratings than the conformists. In public, the other way around. And so one of the takeaways on this is if you could somehow elicit people's opinions privately and then tell everybody, maybe that would break the spell, And where do you see that technique used? So, yes, good, thank you. Bowling? Polling, yes, exactly, yes. We use public polling. I was like, bowling? Ma'am, you are crazy. Polling, yes, public polling, exactly. Sometimes we use public polling in order to keep careful assessment of what the actual base rates of public opinion are so that we don't get swept up in an emperor's dilemma type situation. But another example would be, how many of you have lived in the dorms at some point? No, it's okay. It's all right, me too. It's good. Wow, that many people are unwilling to raise your arms. Okay. So, and when I was in the dorms, they had this thing where they would put up these polls, where they do these private polls, these private surveys of how much people were really drinking and how much they were actually comfortable with the drinking. Do they still do this stuff? Like put up these things? It's weird that they don't do this because it actually kind of works. We were cynical about it. We felt like we were being manipulated, but it was actually very smart. So they put up these signs, these posters that would say, actually, only 12% of people in a recent survey, 12% of undergraduates in a recent survey have been binge drinking in the last month or something like that. And you'd be like, okay, that's not that impressive, actually, but okay. All right, I guess I will feel less pressure to go out and binge drink. And what are they trying to do? What they're trying to do is sort of take the private condition from the experiment and make it public, right? Take privately gathered information where there is no social pressure and then make it the new public information to get a new sample and undermine the spell of pluralistic ignorance. Okay, so in the study that I conducted with my colleagues, the presence of social pressure led people not only to conform, but also to sanction the lone deviant. And the message was that people not only conform in the face of social pressure, they may enforce norms in the face of social pressure as well. Yes? Why was the sixth participant set up to be lower status than the first four? We wanted to sort of grease the wheels for the phenomenon to happen. We wanted to put people in a sort of culturally intimidating atmosphere where they're like, wow, I got in here luckily, based on some random guesses on these art problems, Then I introduced myself. I'm a normal person. These people are very hoity-toity, refined weirdos. And now the one person is, speaking out, is another normal person, essentially. And we wanted to sort of grease the wheels for the phenomenon to happen so we could capture it. But we also wanted to capture the Hans Christian Andersen story, too, which has all these people who are fit for office, supposedly, conforming to the norm, and then one lone child who doesn't see the clothes speaks out. And we were curious, would that break the spell? And we found it'll break the spell if it's done in private, though it wouldn't be done in private in the Hans Christian Andersen story. It would be public. So in public, it wouldn't work. Okay, so the effects of false enforcement. People enforcing norms, or this is the takeaways from the study, people who enforce norms may not privately believe in them. Indeed, fanaticism might be overcompensation for doubt. Also, enforcement might be a way for people to signal the sincerity of their earlier conformity. So enforcement may not be something that you do because you want people to you want to spread a belief that you have, or you want people to fall in line with a norm that you believe. Instead, it could be that enforcement's just another way to conform. And then finally, once false enforcement does emerge, then it may be that unpopular norms can become very stable, and it can be very hard to get rid of unpopular norms. Because once there's a lot of false enforcement, then social pressure gets amped up. Remember that if you just want to enforce norms because you want people to have your view, and so you sanction people who don't have it, and you praise people who do have your view, then you're going to stop enforcing once everybody believes the view, right? There's no reason to keep enforcing. But if you're enforcing because you're concerned and anxious that people will see through your conformity and see that you're posturing for social approval and that you don't actually have the private belief that you represent yourself to have, then you may never stop. because enforcement serves an expressive purpose, a way to conform as sincerely as possible. It's not because you actually want a consensus to believe in the norm. Okay, so that's the end of the unpopular norms. On Thursday, we're going to talk about bystander non-intervention, and then we'll review for the midterm, probably about half and half, or midterm, we'll call it an exam, whatever. Probably about half and half. If you have any questions, we ended a little early, so I have about 5 minutes up here.